The young widow refused his coat in the snow, and that's when the mountain man fell in love with her. Winter Hollow, Colorado Territory, January 1876. The snow had not stopped in 3 days. It blanketed the small mountain town in silence, muting footsteps and softening even the hard lines of the shuttered shops and crooked fences. Smoke curled from a few chimneys. Most folks had taken shelter long before the wind turned bitter. But down the main street of Winter Hollow, Clara Jameson walked steadily, her boots crunching over ice. Her gloved hands gripped the wooden handle of a two-wheeled cart, its bed loaded with a sack of flour, a bundle of dry kindling, and a child curled beneath her worn quilted coat. Jamie, her 4-year-old son, sat nestled on top of the flour sack, the coat wrapped twice around him. His little hands were tucked close to his chest, and every few yards he peeked out from beneath the edge of the blanket to check on her. "Are you tired, Mama?" he asked softly, his breath a puff of fog. "Are you cold?" Clara glanced down at him, her face flushed from wind and exertion. She did not answer. The sleeves of her faded wool dress barely reached her wrists. Her scarf had loosened from the wind. What warmth she had left, she had given to him. Across the street, outside the blacksmith shop, a man stood beneath the porch awning, arms crossed, eyes following the cart. He was broad-shouldered, wrapped in a thick fur-lined coat with a leather rifle sling across his back. His beard was speckled with snow. Thomas Becket had been watching since she turned onto Main Street. He was not a man who spoke unless he had to. Folks in town called him strange, said he had lived too long alone in the highlands, too many winters in the caves above the timberline. But his eyes, gray like granite, missed little. As Clara passed, Jamie gave a small cough. Barely a squeak, but it was enough. Thomas stepped down from the porch. He walked with purpose, closing the distance in a few strides, then halted beside the cart. Clara stopped, her grip tightening. Without a word, Thomas shrugged out of his heavy coat and held it out toward her. "You are going to freeze," he said simply. "Take this." Clara looked up at him, eye to eye, unmoving. Her voice came out low, edged with steel. "I do not need pity." Thomas hesitated. Just for a moment. He opened his mouth to reply, but never got the chance. Jamie had slipped from the cart, his boots crunching into the snow. He walked up beside his mother and tugged at her sleeve. "Mama," he said, looking up at her with wide, serious eyes. His cheeks were pink, his lips slightly blue. "Please take the coat. If you get sick, I will not know what to do." The street fell into a quiet that felt louder than any sound. A few townsfolk paused at windows, but Clara stood frozen, caught between her pride and her son's trembling voice. Thomas said nothing. He looked at the boy, then back to Clara. Then, in one silent motion, he stepped past them, gently laid the fur coat across a nearby woodpile, and walked away, his boots leaving deep prints in the snow. He never looked back. But Clara did. She stared after him, her hands still cold, her arms still bare. And in her silence, something inside her shifted, not entirely softened, but no longer untouched. Above them, the snow kept falling. The wind had settled, but the cold lingered like a warning. Each morning, Clara Jameson rose before dawn, fingers stiff with frost, breath visible in her own kitchen. She bundled her son Jamie in the same coat she wore the day before, her only one, and wrapped a fraying wool scarf around her neck twice, as though that might fool the winter into sparing her. Her hands were calloused from scrubbing floors. Her back ached from lifting pails of snowmelt and laundry baskets for the boarding house. She took in mending when she could, polished boots for traveling salesmen, and shoveled the porch steps of the chapel every Monday before the Reverend woke. And through it all, Jamie was always with her. He sat quietly in the cart she dragged through the snow-packed streets, his small frame cushioned with a wool blanket and a few folded flour sacks. He watched her every move with wide, unblinking eyes. "Mama," he would say as she paused to catch her breath, "we will go home soon, right? I will be good, I promise." He was always good. Too good, she thought sometimes, for a child who had lost so much. Their cabin stood at the edge of the tree line, barely 2 rooms. The roof sagged in the middle and groaned with every gust of wind. Gaps between the logs had been stuffed with rags and old paper to keep out the cold. The wood stove, a rusted thing with a stubborn flue, filled the air with more smoke than heat. Clara had taken to leaving the front door ajar just enough to let the smoke out, even if it let the cold in. Jamie coughed most nights. That morning, they had returned from the laundry house just as the sky began to spit fresh snow. Clara pushed open the cabin door, arms tired, feet soaked, but as soon as they stepped inside, she froze. The wood stove had been repaired. The pipe was replaced. A new section of chimney had been fitted with care. The surrounding bricks had been sealed with fresh mud mortar. It was not a quick job. Someone had taken their time. And beside the stove, stacked neatly, was a bundle of dry kindling, chopped thin, tied with twine. Clara turned slowly, eyes narrowing. No broken window, no tracks inside. But when she opened the door again, she saw them, heavy boot prints in the fresh snow, leading away toward the trees. Jamie pulled at her coat. "Mama, look, someone fixed it, and left us wood too." His voice was filled with wonder, as if magic had visited their home. Clara did not answer. She stepped toward the stove, knelt, and pressed her hand to the lowest brick, still warm. Her fingers curled into a fist. Jamie looked up at her, blinking. "Was it the man with the big coat?" he asked. Clara's jaw clenched. "Maybe," she said. Then softer, almost to herself, "No one does something for nothing, Jamie, remember that." Jamie shrank a little, not from fear, but from confusion. He sat on the low stool near the fire, wrapping himself in her coat again. "I still think he was nice." Clara struck a match and lit the stove. The fire caught fast, thanks to the dry kindling. She stood and turned away from Jamie, but her hand lingered on the side of the stove, pressed flat against the warmth. She had learned, long ago, that every favor came with a string, and she'd spent years cutting them loose. Help, in her world, was rarely kind. It was condescending, transactional, conditional. But this had no name attached, no one waiting for thanks, no price. He reached behind his back and pulled out a large carrot, clean, unblemished, slightly frost-nipped but still firm. He held it up with both hands. "This is the best one we had," Jamie said, looking up at Thomas. "Mama said not to bring it, but I thought maybe you should have it." For a long moment, no one moved. Thomas bent down, slowly, until he was at Jamie's level. He took the carrot with both hands, as if it were something sacred. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft but full. Jamie nodded, and then turned back to Clara, eyes shining. Clara looked at her son. Then at the man in front of her. Something passed between them, not apology, not acceptance, but something gentler. Something real. "I cannot stop my son from showing gratitude," she said at last. Her voice had lost its edge. She turned, gently taking Jamie's hand. They walked back down the trail, her steps slower than before, her shoulders not quite so squared. Behind them, Thomas remained standing, still holding the carrot. He stared after them for a while, then tucked it carefully inside his coat, right over his heart. The trail to Thomas's cabin had softened under the weak January sun. Snow still lined the edges, but patches of brown earth peeked through, slick and muddy in places. Clara stepped carefully, balancing the woven basket in her hands. Jamie walked beside her, bouncing lightly with each step. "Mama said we're going to say thank you the proper way," he whispered, gripping the side of the basket as though it carried treasure. Inside were a warm jar of split pea soup, wrapped in cloth, slices of cured meat, saved from 2 weeks of rationing, and a crusty loaf of fresh bread Clara had baked that morning, her first in months. It was not much, but it was real, earned, honest. As they reached the clearing, Thomas was already at the door. He had been stacking wood along the side of the cabin and turned just in time to see them coming through the trees. For a second, he only stared. Then, without a word, he stepped aside and opened the door wider, his eyes scanning Clara's face, then Jamie's eager one. "Come in," he said simply. The inside of the cabin was plain but warm. A low fire crackled in the hearth, casting a soft light against the wooden walls. On the table, a dented tin cup sat beside a worn book and a folded piece of canvas. Clara set the basket down carefully. Jamie climbed onto the bench without needing to be told. Thomas added another chair and poured water into 3 mismatched mugs. Dinner was quiet at first, broken only by the clink of spoons and Jamie's soft hums of appreciation. Then Jamie began to talk. He spoke of his father, how he used to whistle while chopping wood, how he would lift Jamie high so he could see the stars, and how he had promised to teach him how to build a fire without smoke. Clara sat still, her hands wrapped around her mug, her eyes watching her son, her face unreadable. Thomas listened, never interrupting. He only nodded now and then, poured more water, and passed the bread without being asked. And then, Jamie coughed. It started small, then sharp. He grabbed at his throat, eyes wide. Clara was on her feet in an instant. "Jamie?" The boy gasped, tried to speak, but only a choked wheeze escaped. Thomas was across the room before Clara could reach him. He knelt behind Jamie, steady hands wrapping around the boy's small frame. One swift motion. Another. The third push sent the piece of bread flying onto the floor. Jamie drew in a breath, shaky, loud, and began to cry. Clara dropped beside him, gathering him close. Her hands trembled as she stroked his hair, whispering nothing and everything all at once. Jamie clung to her, face buried in her shoulder. Thomas stepped back, quiet as always. Later, when Jamie had fallen asleep against Clara's side, his breath even and warm, she looked up. "I have not been that afraid since the day my husband died," she said. Thomas sat on the opposite bench, elbows on his knees, eyes lowered. "I lost my younger brother," he said, 12 years old, fell from a mule crossing the pass. By the time I got to him, there was nothing I could do. "I'm sorry," Clara whispered. "I learned after that. First aid, pressure points, breathing techniques. I swore to never be too late again." There was a long silence. Then Clara said, barely more than a breath, "Thank you for not looking at me like I'm some broken ghost." Thomas met her gaze. "I've never seen you that way," he said. "I see a mother holding the whole damn world together with both hands and not letting go." Something unspoken passed between them then. A shift, a loosening of something long held tight. When it was time to leave, Clara gathered Jamie gently into her arms. He stirred, murmured something sleepy, and tucked his head under her chin. Thomas opened the door for them. Clara paused on the threshold. "We'll come again," she said, then added with the hint of a smile, "Next time, I'll bring honey." Thomas nodded. He did not say a word. But the oil lamp in the window stayed lit long after their footprints disappeared into the snow. Winter Hollow was a small place, but its rumors traveled like wildfire through dry grass. It did not take more than a single set of eyes to see Clara descending the mountain trail with Jamie in her arms, and to begin talking. By the next morning, it had reached every corner of town. A whisper from the pastor's wife, spoken just loud enough for the general store clerk to hear. "Won't be long before she moves that child in with the mountain man." And then from Tom Ellison, the innkeeper who had once offered Clara a room, and more, shortly after her husband's death, only to be turned down. Now his voice carried from behind the bar like an oil slick on water. "That Beckett fellow, living up there all alone like a wolf. No one does that unless they've got something to hide. Mark my words, she's being used." Clara heard it first from the laundress's young helper, a girl who adored Jamie and could not quite hide her worry. Then again at the seamstress's shop, when the woman who used to praise Clara's quiet strength suddenly found excuses not to speak to her. By midday, Clara's spine was straight as a blade. She said nothing to Jamie as she buttoned his coat and kissed the top of his head. She told the neighbor they would be back before dark and began the climb up the trail without warning or invitation. The snow had thinned, but the wind had not. It bit at her cheeks as she climbed, and by the time she reached the cabin, her breath came sharp and fast. She did not pause. Thomas opened the door with a quiet kind of surprise that was almost joy. For a flicker of a second, the corners of his mouth lifted, but it faded when he saw her face. She stood tall, holding something bundled in her hands. It was the wool scarf, the one he had given Jamie when the cold had worsened. Clara extended it to him, her voice calm but unyielding. "I cannot let my son grow up, surrounded by whispers," she said. "You have been kind, I will not forget that, but I will not let Jamie hear people say his mother traded dignity for warmth." Thomas took the scarf slowly, folding it once, then again. His fingers lingered on the edges. He looked at her, but said nothing at first. She watched him, her chin high, her eyes guarded. "I understand," he said at last. His voice was soft but steady. "If stepping back keeps the world quieter for him, I will step back." Clara did not reply. Her hand flexed once at her side, as if reaching for something she had no right to touch. She turned and walked away, the wind catching the hem of her coat, whipping it around her boots. Her shoulders were stiff, each step deliberate. Behind her, Thomas stood still in the doorway, scarf pressed to his chest like something that no longer belonged to him. He did not call out. He did not follow. He had known loss before, and this silence, felt no different. No anger lingered between them, no betrayal. Only the hollow, aching distance, carved by pride and pain. That night, the wind howled louder through the trees. The cold crept in deeper, and for both of them, the world felt lonelier than it had in a long, long time. The blizzard came without warning. By dusk, the sky had turned the color of slate, and by nightfall, the world had disappeared behind a white wall of snow and wind. Inside the small cabin, Clara pressed the back of her hand to Jamie's forehead and felt the fever rising like a fire under his skin. He had stopped talking hours ago. His breaths were shallow, quick. His cheeks flushed red, not from cold, but from something worse. She wrapped him tighter in every quilt they owned, stoked the fire until the room filled with smoke, and tried not to show fear. But her hands trembled as she dipped the rag into the basin again. The water was barely lukewarm. Outside, the wind screamed. There was no chance of getting to town. The road was already buried, and the snow fell sideways in sheets. Even if she tried, she would not make it half a mile carrying Jamie. Clara sat beside the bed, holding his small hand in both of hers, whispering softly, "It is just a chill, sweetheart. You are strong. Just like your papa was. You will be fine." But Jamie did not stir. She closed her eyes. For the first time in years, she prayed. Then, through the roar of the storm, she heard something impossible. Hoofbeats. They were distant at first, then clearer, heavy, deliberate, cutting through the wind like a hammer through silence. Clara rushed to the window and wiped the fog from the glass with her sleeve. A horse appeared out of the white, steam rising from its flanks. On its back sat Thomas Becket, hunched forward, snow clinging to his beard and coat. Behind him, another figure, a man with a leather satchel clutched to his chest, the town doctor. Clara threw open the door just as Thomas dismounted, nearly collapsing as he helped the doctor down. "I brought what I could," he said, handing her a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Blankets, medicine, dried wood. She stared at him, speechless. Her lips parted, but nothing came out. Thomas met her eyes only briefly, then stepped back into the storm. He did not wait for thanks. He did not cross the threshold. He simply turned and began to walk away, snow already erasing his tracks. Inside, the doctor worked quickly. Fever, infection. Bad, but not hopeless. He mixed powders into water, placed cold cloths on Jamie's chest, and burned dried herbs near the hearth. Hours passed. The storm outside raged on. Near dawn, Jamie stirred. His eyes fluttered open. He blinked up at Clara, then smiled faintly. "Mama," he whispered. Clara leaned close, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Shh, baby, I'm here." Jamie's small fingers found hers. His voice, though weak, held a clarity that pierced straight through her. "Was that him?" Clara frowned. "Who?" "The man in the storm," Jamie breathed. "The one who brought the doctor." Clara hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." Jamie gave the smallest smile. "He is. Just like Papa." Then he drifted back to sleep. Clara sat frozen for a long moment. Her heart beat loud in her ears. Then, without grabbing a coat, without thinking, she threw open the cabin door and ran into the snow. The wind cut her skin like knives. Snow flew in every direction, blinding, stinging. She stumbled through the drifts, calling out, "Thomas!" Nothing. She kept running, hands bare, hair loose in the storm. "Thomas!" And then, through the haze, she saw a figure, just a silhouette, slowly vanishing between the trees. She cried his name again. This time, he stopped, turned. Their eyes met across the white distance. For the first time, there was no pride between them, no defense, only a mother whose heart had broken open, and a man who had never really left. Clara took one step forward, then another, and Thomas walked back toward her, through the snow. The thaw came slowly, but surely. Snow still clung to the shadows of the trees, but the icicles had begun to melt from the cabin eaves, dripping into tiny pools of clear water. The wind, once biting, now carried the scent of pine and damp earth. That evening, Clara lit the lamp early and laid the table with quiet purpose. She placed 3 plates, one more than usual, and sliced bread she had baked that morning. Jamie helped her carry the stew pot, humming as he did. She wore her hair down for the first time in months. When Thomas knocked, she did not hesitate. She opened the door with a smile, not out of politeness, but something warmer, steadier. He stepped inside, removing his coat without being asked, brushing snow from his shoulders. The cabin was warmer than he remembered, or perhaps it only felt that way. Jamie greeted him with glee and took his hand, leading him to the table. "Mama made your favorite," he declared. "Well, we think it's your favorite." Thomas chuckled, glancing at Clara, who gave a small, amused shake of her head. "It might be," she said. "You will have to tell us." They ate slowly, not from hesitation, but from comfort. Jamie filled the silence with stories about birds he had seen, dreams he barely remembered, and how he wanted to learn to make a fire like his papa had promised, and now, maybe, with someone else. Thomas listened, as he always did, with that quiet attentiveness that made even the smallest words feel heard. After dinner, Clara poured tea. As she handed Thomas his cup, her fingers brushed his. She did not pull away. He looked up. She did not look down. There was no declaration, no breathless confession. Only two people sitting close enough to share silence without needing to fill it. Jamie had curled up on the rug by the fire, humming to himself, eyelids heavy. Clara stood, walked to the wooden cabinet in the corner, and opened it slowly. She reached inside and pulled out a coat. The same coat he had offered her that day in the snow, the one he had left behind on the woodpile. She had never returned it, never worn it. Until now. She crossed the room and stood in front of him. Then, gently, she laid the coat across his shoulders. Her hands lingered, smoothing the fabric near his collar. "That day," she said softly, "I refused this coat." Thomas looked up at her, still as stone. "But today," Clara continued, her voice barely more than a breath, "I would like to keep it. And the man who gave it to me." His breath caught. He did not speak. He only reached up, his hand resting atop hers, where it lay on his shoulder. She did not move away. Neither of them did. And in the quiet room, lit only by firelight and soft lamplight, something unspoken settled into place, like snow falling on warm earth. Spring came like a breath held too long, finally released. The snow retreated to the shadows, replaced by tender shoots of green that peeked through the thawing ground. Wildflowers bloomed in scattered bursts across the hills, yellow and purple and white, like laughter returned to the land. Atop a gentle rise overlooking the valley, a small cabin stood, its walls mended, its roof no longer leaking. Smoke curled from the chimney, fragrant with pine. Jamie's laughter rang out through the trees. He rode, in wide, wobbly circles on a small, sturdy pony, a gift from Thomas. The boy's legs barely reached the stirrups, but his posture was proud. He wore a scarf Clara had knit and a wide-brimmed hat that had once belonged to his father. "Look at me," Jamie called. "I'm faster than the wind." Thomas leaned against the railing of the porch, watching the boy with a quiet smile. Clara sat beside him on the wooden bench, her head resting lightly on his shoulder, one of his arms wrapped around her waist. Their fingers intertwined, firm, sure, and without hesitation. They did not speak often, not up here. Words had already been said. The rest lived in the silence between them, the kind that needed no filling. Below them, the town of Winter Hollow stirred with life. The same people who once whispered behind closed doors now waved openly when they saw Clara pass by with Jamie, or when Thomas came down for supplies. Their curiosity had been replaced by respect, earned not by declarations, but by quiet resilience. For what they had built here was not born of pity, but of patience, of firelight and bread shared, of a boy's trust, a mother's strength, and a mountain man's steady presence. "Do you regret it?" Clara asked, her voice soft and close to his ear. "Regret what?" he murmured. "Giving away your coat." Thomas glanced down at her, eyes warm. "No," he said, "you kept it, and you brought me in from the cold." She smiled, then turned her face toward the valley. Jamie's pony stumbled slightly, but the boy righted himself with a triumphant whoop. "I'm all right," he shouted. "I'm a real rider now." Clara laughed, the sound light and full, like something that had been buried deep inside her, finally rising to the surface. Thomas kissed her temple. On that hill, where wildflowers bloomed and the wind carried nothing but the scent of earth and pine, love had taken root. And for the first time in a long time, it did not need to be hidden. If this story stirred something in your heart, if it reminded you that love doesn't always arrive with fireworks, but sometimes with a coat left quietly on a woodpile, then you've found your place here with us. Out here on Wild West Love Stories, we tell tales of quiet devotion, stubborn hearts, and the kind of love that takes root in the harshest of seasons. Stories like Clara's and Thomas's, born not from grand gestures, but from small, steady acts of grace. So, if you felt the warmth in this one, do not leave without hitting that hype button and subscribing to the channel. We've got more stories coming, of outlaws and angels, homesteads and heartbreak, and of course, of love that defied the cold. Until next time, keep your fire burning and your heart open. This is Wild West Love Stories, where every love leaves a legacy.